The U.S. is beefing up its Navy presence in the North Atlantic just 7 years after it was stood down. The Pentagon says it's to deal with the increased threat from Russia. Diane Estabrook reports.
The U.S. Navy says its Second Fleet will be back in commission this summer, operating out of Norfolk, Virginia. The fleet, which was eliminated in a cost-cutting move 7 years ago, is being reestablished to counter what the Pentagon calls a rising threat from Russia. At a ceremony in Norfolk on Friday, Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, said, "Our national defense makes it clear that we are back in an era of great power competition as the security environment continues to grow more challenging and complex." Russia's Navy has stepped up patrols in the Atlantic, and both Russia and NATO have been building up forces in Eastern Europe at levels not seen in decades. While Russia has fewer ships than it did during the height of the Cold War, U.S. officials are especially concerned about its expanded submarine fleet and increased presence in the Atlantic Ocean. But one military expert sees this more as saber-rattling than an outright threat of war.
I think what the Russians will do is probably over time react with more submarines operating in the Atlantic, more messages to us that beware. But I think that this will be kept at a relatively low level, and I really don't see a huge escalation or any escalation proceeding from these actions.
The U.S. Second Fleet will be responsible for an area extending halfway across the Atlantic and will include a staff of more than 200. Diane Estabrook, Al Jazeera.
The U.S. is beefing up its naval presence in the North Atlantic to deal with a rising threat from Russia. It's reviving its Second Fleet, which was disbanded 7 years ago to save money. The move coincides with a steady buildup of Russian and NATO forces in Eastern Europe to levels not seen for decades. More on this, let's talk to Robert Hunter, Senior Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University. He joins us live now from Washington via Skype. Thanks very much for being with us. So what do you think is the main motive here for the United States?
I think the administration is trying to send a couple of signals. One, they're saying to the Russians, we do take what you're doing very seriously. More important, I think, is to try to reassure countries in Central Europe, the Baltic states, Poland and the like, that are worried about what Mr. Putin and Russia has been doing in Central Europe, particularly in Ukraine. After all, the United States has a certain number of ships. You can organize them in different ways. And if you put them in a new thing and call it the Second Fleet, it doesn't really change anything except symbolically and maybe in a bit of training, because ships are assigned by the United States when and where they are needed, and what you call them really is a secondary matter.
And how do you expect Russia to respond to this?
Well, I think they'll probably say that this is more indication, as Russia speaking now, that the United States doesn't want to include them in the outside world, that it is being provocative, that the idea of cooperation with America is difficult. I don't expect them to do anything differently, except the battle of words that's going on. The problem in the battle of words between the United States and Russia is that things can get out of hand at some point, as we've been seeing in the Middle East, for example.
And it's been put forward that this move is part of a switch to an era of what's known as great power competition. In other words, kind of rivalry between big powers like Russia, the United States, and China, rather than what we've seen over the last few years, which is the countering the threat of non-state actors. What do you think of that argument?
Well, this is the argument that's coming out of the Defense Department. It was always inevitable that the United States and China would find themselves as competitors, as China has risen so dramatically. It was also inevitable that Russia would recover from the ashes of the Cold War and become a somewhat serious country again. And when efforts to work something out with the Russians failed, they did some wrong things, we did some wrong things, yes, you get more into competition. But my concern is that too many people here and in some parts of Europe, and maybe also in Russia, are seeing this in particularly military terms, rather than saying, all right, there need to be diplomatic steps taken. There need to be serious people on both sides, let's say here in Washington and also in Moscow, talking about things that we do have in common. We do have in common preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. We have in common making sure that climate change is not out of control and the Arctic is usable. We do have in common not having a new Cold War. There's an awful lot we have in common. Unfortunately, it has been useful to some people in Washington and clearly useful also to Mr. Putin to see this in confrontational terms. And I fear more money is going to go in the military on both sides, and now we hear on our side, to no good purpose.
Good to speak with you, Robin Hunter, there in Washington.
Thank you.